We then go now on to the Swedish case. The first speaker will be Mr. Ingvar Persson, who is working for the Council for Swedish Council, National Council for Nuclear Waste, and who has a law background.
In my presentation, I will initially mention something about the importance of the Aarhus Convention and how it has been implemented in Sweden. And in conclusion, I will report on some experiences in connection with the ongoing permit review of the final repository for spent nuclear fuel in Sweden. Mr. Bengt Hedberg, who comes after me, explains in more detail about the licensing process. But I would like to start with a short reminder and give a brief background to the opportunities that Aarhus Convention gives the public in general and specifically the environment movement. Before Aarhus Convention, legal procedural issues was long been considered a national issue. The public's right to participate in decision-making process and to have access to justice in environmental matters has not been regulated to any great extent by international law before. So if there were flashes of light in this darkness, one example is the Nordic Environmental Protection Convention. That is a regional agreement between the Nordic countries concerning environmental questions. The development to change this started actually with the Rio Declaration. Even though the convention is not legally binding, Article 10 in the declaration stated that environmental issues is best handled with participation of all citizens, access to information, and opportunity to participate in decision-making processes. And with these SOFIA guidelines as a starting point, about 30 nations started to negotiate the content and design of the Aarhus Convention. Next slide, please. The Aarhus Convention constitute a new kind of environmental convention as it links the protection of human rights with the protection of the environment. The convention is based, as its title indicates, and we have mentioned it before during this round, on 3 different pillars, namely the public's right to information, right to participate in the decision-making processes, and access to justice in environmental processes. It is primarily in Article 9.2 and 9.3 of the Convention that the right of environmental organizations to speak in favor of public interests are regulated. Article 9.2 specifically provides that environmental organizations shall be given access to justice and describes a far-reaching right of action regarding all acts and omissions committed by authorities in various permit processes. The second significant provision, Article 9.3, concerns environmental organizations' access to judicial review of authorities' decisions and omissions in various supervisory matters, and its ability to act directly against an operator through a civil process. The goal with the convention is to contribute to protecting current and future generations' right to a good environment. The Aarhus Convention was implemented in Swedish law in 2005. The rights that the convention gives the public were to a large extent already guaranteed in Swedish law. Environmental organizations, according to the now valid legislation, have the right within the appeal period to appeal judgments and decisions on permits and approval of environmentally hazardous activities, exemptions for the protection of areas, and against decisions on measures relating to the supervision of the authorities. The requirement is that it concerns a non-profit association or other legal entity with the main purpose of protecting nature, conservation, or environmental protection interests, has conducted operations in Sweden for at least 3 years and has at least 100 members, or otherwise shows that the organizations has support from the public. Next slide, please. To achieve the requirement for all activities specified in the convention, a certain number of Swedish laws were supplemented. For instance, the Environmental Code, the Roads Act, the Civil Aviation Act, and the Minerals Act. Although the rights in the Aarhus Convention largely complied with Swedish laws in connection with the implementation, there are provisions in the convention that some organizations consider have not been implemented in Swedish law. Among other things, there are no provisions in Swedish legislation that give environmental organizations the right to appeal supervisory decisions or request that the permit decision should be reconsidered with the convention itself, which the convention itself enables. Another example, the Aarhus Convention was not implemented in the Forest Management Act through any special provincial provisions. This led to a case where an environmental organization was not given the right to appeal a decision by the Swedish Forest Stewardship Council to allow felling a forest area with, according to the environmental organization, was worth preserving. The decision to deny the environmental organization the right to appeal was pursued all the way up to the Supreme Administrative Court in Sweden. Next slide, please. Supreme Administrative Court concluded that the Aarhus Convention should be applied in this case and gave the environmental organizations the right to appeal the Swedish Forest Stewardship Council decision. The court referred to judgment of the European Court of Justice in a special case, with which stated that when the convention provision can be applied, both the situation covered by national law and to situation covered by union law, there is a definite interest in the provision being interpreted in a uniform manner, independently of the circumstance in which it is to be applied. This is to ensure access to effective remedies for the public in accordance with the requirements of the Aarhus Conventions. And the court emphasized that EU law takes precedence over national law according to the principle of precedence. in EU. Next slide, please. The Swedish experience based on the planning of a final repository for spent nuclear fuels. I'd like to say something, to mention something about the ongoing process that has been going on in Sweden since 2011 concerning permits to build a final repository for the spent nuclear fuel that has been generated since 1973 in connection with the operation of the Swedish nuclear power plants. To be correct, there is also the Swedish there is also a small amount of used MOX fuel from Germany that is planned to be completed in the Swedish final repository. In my opinion, during the permit process, there have been extremely good opportunities for the public and environmental organization to present their views. Next slide, please. A summary of the various occasions in the process when there have been opportunities to present views is presented in this slide. You could say that the process has come halfway, but the government has a decisive influence. And what have the two heaviest consultative bodies said? The Land and Environmental Court has stated that there are uncertainties regarding the containment of the spent nuclear fuel, the copper capsules, and the supervisory authority considers there are sufficient conditions to begin construction of the final repository. So there are two opposite views in this trial. An interesting provision in the Environmental Code is that the City Council has the veto right against the permit being granted. And in Sweden, the City Council has, in this case, the City Council has accepted the construction of the final repository. And that is what I will have to say, and we can continue then to more detailed description of the Swedish final repository.
We thank you very much for your introduction into the Swedish situation. Bengt Hedberg has just written to me. I mean, he's a member of the regulator, the SSM, the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority, and he oversees there the whole radioactive waste issue. He just let me know that he had to change computer because of a technical problem. We will not be able to see him, which is a pity because he has a wonderful smile. But you will have to think a wonderful smile, Swedish smile, behind it when he is telling us a bit more about the backgrounds from the view of the nuclear regulator.
As Ingvar pointed out, I will explain a little bit more on the practical implementation of public participation. So just to set the scene and explain the basic prerequisites. In Sweden, a nuclear reactor licensee is by law required to manage spent nuclear fuel and nuclear waste. And they are also, a reactor licensee is also required jointly with other reactor licensees every third year to submit an updated program for necessary research and development. And it's important to point out that the reactor licensees cooperate on a voluntary basis. There is no legal requirement for cooperation. And to the right, you see the overall system that is under development. I will, on the next slide please, address what's interesting for this roundtable, and that is the ongoing licensing processes that Ingvar mentioned. There are two processes, one for the establishment of a system to manage spent nuclear fuel consisting of a spent fuel repository planned to be sited in Östhammar municipality. And then there's an encapsulation plant planned to be constructed in the Oskarshamn municipality. And you can see a map of Sweden with the tentative locations. And there is also a licensing process going on to extend the existing repository for short-lived operational waste to accommodate also decommissioning waste. Next slide, please. So this slide shows or presents the principal elements for public participation. And one very important element is the public's right of access to information that dates back already to 1766. So it's been in place for a very long time. Another important element is the referral of the reactor owners' RD&D program every 3 years to a broad range of stakeholders. Yet another element is the environmental impact assessment consultation process as a mandatory element feeding into the license application under the environmental code. Another element is that the licensing under the environmental code is open for public and stakeholder organization to submit written comments and also to participate in the hearings. And as Ingvar also mentioned, a very important element is the municipality's right to veto a government licensing decision. It should be mentioned also that there is a formal or legal possibility for the government to overrule a veto, but that is not expected to happen. And maybe one of the most important elements also is the provisions for financial support to municipalities and NGOs. Next slide, please. So this is the principal process or flow chart describing the licensing process for nuclear facilities. As Ingvar mentioned, there are two parallel and coordinated processes, one under the environmental code that is closely related to the Aarhus Convention requirements, and then another one under the Act on Nuclear Activities focusing on nuclear and radiation protection. And if you look at this figure, SKB submitted in 2011 two applications, one to the Environmental Court and one to the authority. And the Environmental Court and the authority have submitted statements to the government. And the government is now in a process to decide whether to propose to grant a license under both laws. And the principle here is that after the government has decided to grant a license, they would ask for the municipalities whether they would allow it or not, whether they would like to use the veto or not. But as Ingvar mentioned, the municipalities has already announced that they will not utilize the veto. They will accept the facilities when the government has granted the licenses. And after that, the applications or the issues goes back to the court and to the regulator to set and stipulate conditions. One thing that has been under discussion and which is very important to understand is that all requirements has to be shown to be complied with in the licensing process. And at the bottom of the slide, you can see that this continued process consists of a stepwise authorization process based on specific hold points to verify specifications and assumptions during detailed design, construction, and operation. And this process is not specific for nuclear facilities. It's a principal process used in every major infrastructure project. Next slide, please. So I'll give you some example of public participation. And the main actor in the Swedish system is the implementer, because they are responsible for implementing the necessary activities and the licensing of, or the establishment of necessary facilities. And SKB has been engaged in pre-license dialogue and consultation during the site selection and investigation stage. And it's also important to mention here that the site selection process has been based on a voluntary participation by municipalities. SKB has also established local offices in candidate municipalities and conducted a lot of information and interaction activities. Next slide, please. The other most important actors are the municipalities that may host a future nuclear facility. The Östhammar and Oskarshamn municipalities has received state funding since the early 90s, and thereby making it possible for local competence building, setting up of local review groups to review, for instance, the RD&D program, and to provide it for information and dialogue within the municipalities. And it's also worth to mention that there are well-established cooperation between both municipalities. Next slide, please. When we come to the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority, we are not responsible for, I would say, promoting the implementation of nuclear facilities. As I said before, it's the responsibility of the implementers, the reactor owners, to drive the project. But we are involved in the sense that we are responsible for the review of the RD&D program, and we sent it for consultation referral, as we do also with license applications. And we publish review findings, and we do interact in dialogue with stakeholders, mainly on demand, so that we are not very active ourselves in promoting or setting up information meetings or dialogue meetings without being prompted. Another very important authority is the Swedish National Council for Nuclear Waste, and Ingvar has been attached to them before. I don't know whether it's still the case, but it's an advisory body, an independent advisory body to the government, and consists of 11 members with broad scientific knowledge in natural science, technology, social sciences, and humanities. And they arrange for seminars, and they publish reports on specific issues. And they provide a very important function as an independent organization. Next slide, please. And then when we come to the participation of the non-governmental organizations, as Ingvar pointed out, the provision in the Aarhus Convention has been implemented in the Swedish framework, and thereby promoting or encouraging participation in licensing processes. And since 2005, there has been a special arrangements for funding those activities, initially limited to participation in the licensing process under the environmental code for the KBS3 system. But since 2017, there are alternative arrangements and a broader remit for the NGOs to participate. And they have taken an active part in multitude of consultation meetings, raised many concerns, and as we see today, they are also very much involved in international cooperation. Next slide, please. So to conclude the experiences from our side, in order to have a successful dialogue or successful participation, there is a need for clear definition of roles and responsibilities for involved actors. It's also very important to find ways to finance participation for those organizations that are not directly responsible for the activities. And above all, it takes time. SKB has spent about 30 years from the start until now. And based on the discussions we had before, I also want to mention that Sweden failed a long time ago. We had a process that was not good enough. And based on that failure, SKB set up a very structured and clear process supported by the review of the RD&D program. And as a result, 30 years later, they submitted an application for the spent fuel repository and the encapsulation plant. Next slide, please. So there are some challenges also involved in this for us. Keeping up a good dialogue with stakeholders while maintaining integrity is sometimes a challenge. Another challenge is how to communicate risks to the general public, and also taking into account all different viewpoints in a way that preserves trust from those who provided those viewpoints. It's also a challenge for the communities to keep up the interest. 30 years of information and interaction could be seen to be quite tiresome. And another challenge for, I would say, all organizations is competence management, because there might be a loss of attractiveness for working in the nuclear sector from both implementers and regulators' perspective. And also, I think for NGOs, there might be a problem to keep up the interest for this work. Next slide, please. And that is my final slide. I've indicated successful indicators for a successful dialogue. And a majority of the general public in Östhammar and Oskarshamn have no objection to host a repository for spent fuel and an encapsulation plant. And another indicator is that both municipalities have decided to accept to host the facilities even before being offered the option of veto from the government. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Before we go to the questions, I would like to ask Johan Swahn. Johan Swahn is the director of MKG, that is the NGO secretariat for radioactive waste in Sweden, one of the two groups that represent NGOs or not represent NGOs, but that combine the efforts from NGOs in the radioactive waste discourse in Sweden.
Well, I will give a perspective from an NGO's point of view of the NGO and public engagement on radioactive waste management in Sweden. Next slide, please. I will very shortly talk about the MKG, and also we've already heard quite a lot about the decision-making process for a repository for spent fuel in Sweden. I'll make a few more notes there because it's important when discussing the further 4 points, which are looking at the access to information, the access to public participation, and the access to justice and access to resources in the Swedish situation. So MKG was created in 2004, and it's been working with financing from the Swedish Nuclear Waste Fund between 2005 and 2017. And as Bengt said, since 2017, funding is provided instead by the government budget, and it's managed by the regulator. MKG works for the two largest environmental movement organizations in Sweden, the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, with more than 237,000 members, and also since a few years ago, the Swedish Friends of the Earth, Jordens Vänner, with 2,500 members. MKG gets about 220,000 euros per year at the moment, out of a total of 300,000 euros that are available for the Swedish environmental movement, and the remainder goes to the other organization called Milkas. And MKG is also involved in quite a lot of international work in the EU. Next slide, please. So the most important decision-making process in radioactive waste management in Sweden for the last 20 years has been regarding the spent fuel repository. And you know that SKB developed the method from the mid-1970s. And Bengt has already talked about the review process of the R&D program since 1986 that has gone on. And also then in preparation for an application to develop the environmental impact statement, SKB in the early 2000s started a consultation process. And that process was finished in 2010. And then the license application was submitted to the environmental court and the SSM. Next slide, please. And between 2011 and 2017, the court and the SSM had the review process, and it ended in the autumn of 2017 with the environmental court having its main meeting of the court. And then in January 2018, the court and SSM sent their opinions to the government, where the regulator SSM was in favor of a license application being approved by the government, but the court had certain problems with the integrity of the copper canister. So they advised the government not to give permit unless these issues regarding copper corrosion and the copper canister could be resolved. And at the moment, the government is still evaluating license application, and it has asked for some complementary information and received that from SKB. Next slide, please. So I think Bengt Hedberg mentioned that this is a long time ago. It's the constitutional law says that the public has broad access to information from public bodies such as the government, the courts, local communities, and government agencies such as SSM. So it's easy to access and receive basically any sort of communication that these bodies have, especially when they communicate to outside actors. And in radioactive waste management, the responsibility for R&D lies on the nuclear industry and the implementer SKB. Now, this means that because SKB is a private company, there is no right to access information from the main actor responsible for Swedish radioactive waste management. And this is actually a very big problem in Sweden. So it looks very nice from the outside, but because the SKB is doing all the work and all the research, that the right to access information to SKB does not exist. But only when SKB interacts, for example, the regulator or the court, then that information becomes available because it's a communication with the public body. So SKB can of course publish information it wishes to provide, but it has no interest in making available information on research results that are not in the company's interest. Next slide, please. So access to public participation. There is a long tradition in Sweden to carry out public consultation processes on all matters of government business, I would say. And this means that the legally required R&D program that SKB every 3 years has produced goes out for consultation in the regulatory review and the government review. Actually, not in the government review, but it's part of the regulatory review that goes to the government. And in the public consultation process, anybody can contribute, even private individuals. But most often the consultation process is directed towards the government agencies, affected local communities, academia, and NGOs. And in environmental decision-making, the consultation process is formalized in the Environmental Act. And licensing review, according to the Nuclear Activities Act, is legally obliged to follow the same consultation process as in the Environmental Act. I think Ingvar mentioned some acts where the Environmental Act has been implemented, and one of them is the Nuclear Activities Act. So SKB carried out extended and comprehensive consultation processes for the environmental impact statement development between 2002 and 2010. I agree here with Bengt that it was a very extensive process that they did. Now, at this time also, the Swedish government's scientific advisory board, the Council for Nuclear Waste, was directed by the government to convene meetings to openly discuss important issues raised in the consultation process by NGOs and local communities. And this allowed extra deliberation on important issues outside the scope of the formal SKB consultation process. For example, on alternative sites and methods like deep boreholes, and also on copper corrosion issues. Now, after the SKB submitted the license application in March 2011, the Environmental Court and SSM carried out extensive consultation processes during the licensing activities between 2011 and 2017. The SSM consultation process involves asking for comments on completeness and on issues, but the internal SSM review is mostly close to access of information and is disregarded as work in progress, you should say there. The consultation process of the court is more open, sending comments from different parties, including SSM, to the implementer SKB, and allowing the comments, from SKB to be commented upon, and so forth, so on and so forth. Next slide, please. So the court finally decides that this back and forth process of commenting is no longer providing new information, and then they have the deliberations in the main meeting of the court. This is the most important activity of the court in its deliberations. And in the case of the licensing of spent fuel repository, it took place over a period of 5 whole weeks during the autumn 2017. 1 week was spent in Östhammar and 1 week was spent in Oskarshamn, and then the 3 weeks in Stockholm. And the main meeting of the court is very formal, but anyone that wants to say something will get the possibility. On the issue of the long-term integrity of copper canister, the court added a whole extra day of deliberations, allowing a discussion between SKB's experts and academic corrosion scientists. Also, now in the government review, there has been an open consultation process of the material that SKB has provided on copper corrosion, the additional material they have provided. Next slide, please. So access to justice. As Ingvar said, Sweden has incorporated all 3 pillars of the Aarhus Convention into the environmental legislation. Now, this means that one task of the Environmental Court during its deliberations is to assure that the consultation process for the environmental impact statement has taken place properly, and that issues that have been raised have been taken into due account. So that's part of the court's process to guarantee this. Local communities also, as has previously been stated twice, they are involved in decision-making of the repository and have a veto right until a government decision is taken. And also, as has been mentioned, under certain conditions, the government can overrule the veto. It is possible for locally affected individuals, as well as the environmental NGOs, to appeal all environmental court rulings, but not an opinion to the government. The right to appeal also follows on other administrative decisions that may have a bearing on environmental issues, i.e. by certain decisions that SSM may take in the future. Government decisions can also be appealed basically by any concerned actor to the Supreme Administrative Court. Such an appeal does not deal with the issues, but it's a guarantee that the government's decisions are formally and legally correct. Finally, then, the access to resources. Sweden has an advanced financing system for radioactive waste management where fees are paid by the industry into the nuclear waste fund. Now, the government has full control over how the money in the fund is spent. And of course, SKB, SSM, and the council are funded from the fund. As was previously mentioned, the communities of Östhammar and Oskarshamn, they have had access to resources from the fund to inform and to take part in the decision-making process. And each community can use up to 500,000 euros per year. And it's important to stress that this is not compensation money. The nuclear industry has set up a separate compensation system, not using funding from the Nuclear Waste Fund. Now, between 2005 and 2017, environmental NGOs could receive funding also from the Nuclear Waste Fund according to set criteria. And as has been said, MKG and Milkas have had this funding, whether MKG has connections to these larger Swedish NGOs and NGOs. Milkas has its roots in the Swedish anti-nuclear movement, but both organizations work in parallel and raise sometimes the same, but sometimes different issues. The resources for the communities and NGOs were for long administered by SSM, but more recently, the funding system for the Waste Fund is administered by the Swedish National Debt Office. And after 2017, the funding from the environmental NGOs to work with nuclear waste issues comes from the state budget and is administered by SSM. And the present sum available is about 300,000 euros per year. There's actually a proposal to return the funding to the NGOs to come from the Nuclear Waste Fund instead. Now, of interest is also that the Östhammar community uses a part of its funding from the Waste Fund to fund a local NGO in Östhammar called OSS. So that's basically what I'm going to say. This slide shows there is more information on the work of MKG. I have actually also prepared a bit of discussion about the question of how the system has worked in Sweden in regards to trust and build up of trust and maybe loss of trust between different actors. And I will leave that part to the organizers so they can have that presentation, the extended presentation, also available for the participants. Thank you. Next slide. Yeah, final slide is just this information. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. We've had now 2 sets of presentations from 2 different countries, and we have about 25 minutes still for questions and answers. One of the questions there is also from Céline Pelt from the University of Liège, and she says, well, most of the participants in long-term sensitive projects, for them only being consulted is often not enough. They would like to see a convincing follow-up of how and why their comments and suggestions have been integrated into the decisions. The question is to Lukáš Vondrovič, I suppose. How is the follow-up of suggestions from stakeholders? How is that taken up and how is it guaranteed that they're taken up in the Czech Republic?
Okay, concerning that's very good question. Thank you for that. I just to say that for the follow-up process on a local level is quite challenging because we have to respect that the communities and local stakeholders has the negative approach to the project from the beginning, and we have a responsibility for creating the project. So we must very good balance the duties and the responsibilities in the project. And I have to say that that creating the status is quite challenging from my point of view. We have a very good experience when from this last expert advisory board in last site evaluation, when we clearly stated which comments we can, from the technical point of view, accept and why, and how is incorporated in our materials and which not. So that is, from technical point of view, we must do this procedure to clearly state why we accept something and why we don't accept something. Concerning these stakeholders.
Can I ask you, is there then also a possibility for people who see that then to come back on that and discuss that further?
You mean
once you've given your response on certain input, you publish that. Is there then a further process, or do stakeholders then just have to accept that?
It is about the responsibility. In my point of on my level, we are responsible for the safety and other issue. And we must be sure, because it is our responsibility, that our decision right. And finally, we have to accept some comments and objections, because this is our responsibility. But what we are trying is to make such a way that we can accept the serious objections. But the final responsibility from the technical point of view is ours, and we must be persuaded from the technical point of view that these objections are right and heading in the right way.
That's an interesting. Thank you. It's very interesting. But I would wonder, maybe Bengt Hedberg. Luca just explained and said, well, we get input from and we then respond to that. But in the end, the decision and responsibility for safety is on us as Surao, as the implementer. So we take the final decision and the final point of view. I was wondering, is that indeed also the same situation in Sweden? Is it indeed SKB that is finally responsible for decisions? Or is that a shared responsibility?
Are we talking now about taking care of the input from stakeholders? In the
we're talking about how input from stakeholders works through in decisions finally.
Well, I think it very much depends on the national situation and the division of responsibilities. In the Swedish case, I think it's fairly easy, because the responsibility rests with the reactor operators, and they act as private organizations. And they do not affect decision-making in addition to submitting their application. So decision-making and taking care of any comments from municipalities, from NGOs or the general public is the responsibility of the regulator.
Thank you. There's another question to you, Bengt. That was a bit more of a clarification question. You talk about the applicant in slide 6, and Jan Klaas wanted to know, who is that applicant exactly?
Slide 6. I said applicant. No, I said some example of practical application of public participation.
Okay.
So I'm sorry for my English.
Okay. No, that's okay. Then that's at least clear. But there is one more question to you, so don't go away. And that's also a question probably that we need some more discussion wider about. Concerning the public participation example on the photographs that you've been showing, Emeric Lafranc asks, he says, well, that is you see there an expert presenting work to citizens and doing a sort of question and answers. But is there also presentations from the citizens' point of view and discussions the other way around, so non-expert to expert?
Yes, I would say that there are possibilities for that, primarily during the pre-license consultation under the environmental code. there are possibilities for anyone to ask questions to primarily then to SKB, who is the proponent, but also to the regulator. And there are also other meetings. I mentioned the RD&D program that is reviewed every 3 years. We send it for a comprehensive referral, and we also arrange for a meeting with stakeholders, and they could ask us questions and explain their position.
And if that goes beyond questions, if it is demands or propositions, does that also happen?
Well, of course, anything could be proposed, and then the regulator, in this case, would take it under consideration and make a decision, I would say justify a decision, either taking something on board and do something with it, or reject it with the explanation why not to go ahead with it.
Thank you. Thank you. There were a few questions coming in about what I suppose is Stutvik. There was a question from Leloan, who would like to know whether Sweden has a threshold for low activity or radioactive waste, after which certain waste can be recycled and treated as conventional material. And related to that, there is a question whether there have been environmental assessments carried out around the very low level radioactive metals reprocessing plant that is now acquired by EDF, and whether such recycled metals are finding buyers. Who of you could answer that question?
Can do.
Johan.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's certainly so. I also already answer, I think, wrote an answer about this. It's the
Sorry, I haven't seen it yet.
It's the EDF Cyclife facility at Studsvik that is a melter, and they do free release metals, steel from that, according to the EU regulations, EU criteria, basically. The problem for them is that there's no Swedish metal handler or re-smelting facility that will take this waste. So we don't know where it goes, and because SSM, the regulator, classifies all this information as commercial, it's not possible to follow where the steel goes to. But apparently it probably goes down somewhere in Europe to a smelter down there instead.
Thank you. Another question for Bengt from Gilles Debreu. He said, I'm wondering why SSM, having recommended the application to the Swedish government, so SSM recommended the application for the final storage for high-level nuclear waste to the Swedish government, is now the reviewer of additional information from SKB on copper corrosion, as that has been requested by the Environmental Court. One could expect, he says, in advance already, that SSM would find this satisfactory because it already made a recommendation towards the Swedish government. Or am I wrong? Gilles asks.
I find it difficult to see and read the question, but it's a bit tricky to explain. But general environmental issues are regulated by the Environmental Code, and the Nuclear Activities Act and the Radiation Protection Act addresses only nuclear safety and radiation protection, and basically the release of nuclides to the environment. There is, as we explained, a parallel licensing process according to the Environmental Code and the Nuclear Activities Act. And in an ideal situation, you would have a perfect division of responsibilities between the Environmental Court and the nuclear regulator in order to avoid any confusion, but that's not the case. And the Environmental Court has the right to assess also issues falling under the Nuclear Activities Act. So what happened was, this is my understanding of things. I do not claim that this is an absolute truth, because I'm not involved in the details in this. But SSM has a lot of expert and has been reviewing the nuclear issues, if we call them so, the copper corrosion, bentonite, host rock, under a long time. And based on the information in the Nuclear Activities Act, the supporting material, the regulator decided that from the perspectives of the Nuclear Activities Act, the application was satisfactory. So SSM submitted a statement to the government saying that, stating that we recommended the government to grant a license. Now, these processes are run in parallel. So the Environmental Court submitted their statement at the same time, but we were not aware of that. So when they decided to address also elements that normally would fall within the remit of the Nuclear Activities Act, they came to a different conclusion. Now, I think it's really important to understand also that the statement from the court was not a recommendation to decline the application, but the statement from the court contained basically two elements. One was a recommendation to government to grant permissibility for the encapsulation plant in Oskarshamn. And the other recommendation was basically to say to the government that the spent fuel repository in Östhammar should be granted permissibility, provided that SKB provides some supplementary information related to copper corrosion issues. SKB, the government then requested SKB to submit such information, which SKB did, and the government then asked SSM to review this material, which SSM did. And from a perspective of the nuclear regulator, the supplementary material didn't contain anything that would change the judgment by SSM. So that's why SSM then submitted a statement to the government saying that we find the supplement satisfactory. But it is a complicated situation because we have two licensing processes in parallel. There is some overlap and there is possibility to make different judgments.
Would you like to react on that still, Johan?
Well, I think that Bengt described it quite well. Now, what Bengt perhaps did not mention is that there is actually a quite critical scientific opinion in the Swedish corrosion circles that are concerned about that SKB is not doing its copper corrosion work properly, and that also part of the review done by SSM of the supplementary material was reviewed by researchers from the Royal Institute of Technology, and they were quite critical, but SSM did not take that into account very much, or rather not at all, I would say, when they said that to the government then that they thought that the supplementary information was sufficient. But I agree also with Bengt, there was no actual added information by SKB, not very much, and therefore I wonder what the court is thinking about this at this time. But of course, then we will see what the government says. And I will also shortly just say that there has been a development where an experiment called the LOOT experiment in the Hard Rock Laboratory in Esbø, there have been retrieval of two 20-year-old experimental packages there quite recently. And they have also come into play now because the question is whether the corrosion, which is quite big there with pitting corrosion in those experiments over 20 years, whether that will influence the decision of the government. And the regulator has an ongoing project to review the copper corrosion results, and they have using external consultants for this from the UK to do this. And we don't know what will happen here, but it's a question of interpretation of the results. Basically, it's science, so it should not be so difficult. But one of the big problems that SSM has is that this question of they cannot really, with the legal basis, ask for all the information that SKB has, because SKB has no legal obligation to provide, let's say, all the results that should be available. And we see this, I think, from MKG side and the Swedish environmental movement, that the results that have been reported are not really up to satisfactory scientific basis.
Just comment on what Johan said. I will not discuss the issue. I will just say that it's a pity that a representative from SKB is not around, because that might have provided some additional information. I will not continue the discussion, because it might be seen that I defend SKB, and I have never ever been involved in detailing those issues. But the discussion is, of course, open, but in order to have a fair discussion, I think SKB should be involved in such a discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, but we're also not doing that discussion on this platform. I think it was more to have an overview also of the people who are here, of what kind of discussions are taking place. I think then it's good to hear these different visions. And there's a question which is, I think, Ingvar, you are the most likely person to be able to give an answer on this. There are several questions now that relate around the implementation of the Aarhus Convention within Swedish law. Maas Goldstick noted that he said, well, when Aarhus was signed, Sweden made a reservation on Articles 9.1 and 9.10, which are the articles on access to information, on access to justice, whereby it did say it would bring its reservations under Article 9.2 as soon as possible into compliance with the convention. It doesn't say so about 9.1, where it says that it is not possible for citizens and NGOs to go to court on access to information concerning information coming from lawmaking processes within the government. And there are other questions that came up just now, and I'm just having a look there, where it is said by somebody called Sheila, how is it possible to incorporate the 3 pillars of the Aarhus Convention if the laws in the country work differently from what the Aarhus Convention stands for? Do you think that Sweden is not properly applying the Aarhus Convention in its?
That is what at least the Supreme Administrative Court concluded when they had to deal with the appeal from the environmental organizations. So that is true. According to the proceedings of European law, if Sweden not has implemented all provisions in the Aarhus Convention in the Swedish legislation, the Aarhus Convention is valid anyway. So if there is another question, example concerning information from SKB, so it's possible you have to take the questions once again up to the Supreme Administrative Court, but it's possible that you could go to the Aarhus Conventions, all the provisions there, and have these provisions as a base to take more questions about, for instance, that Johan said, information from SKB is very hard to get concerning the environmental questions. You could put another case, probably all the way up to Supreme Administrative Court, but there is possibilities to get information, not concerning economic questions, but concerning environmental questions from SKB. So, to be frank, Sweden honest, has not implemented Aarhus Convention in its all matters. So there is still possibilities for environmental organizations to act. And concerning the copper corrosion questions, I can say that the question is on the government's table just now, because they have to take a decision about the permissibility according to the environmental code. And if the government said yes, there will be a decision on a permit for this repository. But if the government say no, there is all the thing fails, there will be no more questions according to the repository permit, if not new facts. All the copper corrosion is on the table. So I think that the government now is taking a look at this question, collect all informations concerning this very vital subject about copper corrosion before they go further with yes or no concerning permissibility for these questions. And
Ingvar, I want to do one more question. I want to ask one more question.
Has said there are more information needed before the government could take the final stand in this question.
Ingvar, I'm skating against a second pointer on my clock here, and there's one more question that I also want to have your opinion on, and there's one more question that I also would like to have your opinion on before we go into a short break. But of course, what you said about the Aarhus, I mean, if there is indeed this feeling that there is non-compliance with the Aarhus Convention, it's also logical to bring it up at the Aarhus Convention itself at a certain moment to judge whether Sweden is in line or not. And these cases can be brought to the Aarhus Convention Compliance Committee also by citizens. So that is a road. But there is one more question. First of all, there was a compliment here from David Lowry on the clarity of the three presentations, with even a bravo. But there is a question attached to it, and he says the model to have MKG and Milkas publicly funded, producing expertise in all these different processes. Is such a model, do you think that it indeed enhances better decision making and disclosure of documents? And would you recommend it for outside of Sweden, the model of Milkas and MKG?
Are you asking me that question?
Yes, I'm first asking you, and then I will ask the other two. You have a few seconds to answer.
Okay. What is special with the Swedish process is that the government, according to the environmental code, is the government has to take a stand on the permissibility for the questions. That is a provision which is from 1975 concerning other environmental questions. So, and that is incorporated in the environmental code today.
The role of
yes,
the role of MKG and Milkas, the fact that NGOs are funded. publicly. Does that help?
Yes, the government is collecting information and views from various organizations, and it's as long as the government not has taken any stand of the permissibility questions, they can always submit informations and questions to the government. The government collect all information on its table before it take a decision concerning permissibility. So it's possible for all organizations to as long as the government has not made a decision, to inform the government. So
Bengt,
it's possible.
Bengt, what is your vision on how on the role of MKG and Milkas in such a process?
Well, I think that it's good to provide provisions so that interested stakeholders can participate. But how to do it, I think, might vary. How to do it in a good way might vary between countries, because the infrastructure of each country is different. You know, you have basic legislation for how to run the country, the hierarchy, the administrative act, and that is different from country to country. And it might be quite difficult to copy a feature in one national setting to another national setting. But in a general sense, I think involving as many stakeholders, if I put it that way, as possible is, in a general sense, a good thing. So financing.
Johan, you've got 20 seconds.
Yeah.
Johan, you've got 20 seconds.
The short answer is yes. The important thing is to do it early, to start early, and to realize that the environmental movement, the NGOs, have many more other issues that they want to work with. And if you really want to have them in there, you have to provide resourcing for them. And that is what the very clever people in the Swedish government already understood around the year 2000. And they first gave the money to the community and then to the NGOs to get more plurality in the discussion. I think it's worked quite well.
Lady and gentlemen, and other ladies that spoke this morning and gentlemen that spoke this morning and yesterday, I thank you very much for a lot of information that we got from different countries, different systems, different ways to operate. I think there was a lot in this that can inspire us also to improve the processes in different countries.